Right. Okay, so there's one more thing I want to talk to you about, and that's panpsychism. Have you heard of that before?
Sure. Yeah.
So yeah, so I guess the general idea is consciousness exists. That's claim number one. I guess it could be debated. But if it exists, and if it exists in not only us, but other animals, how far down the chain does that go? Like, you know, if we're conscious and most mammals or all mammals are probably conscious, what about like some baby little tadpole? Or what about some even smaller, more primitive form of life? And where does the questioning end?
It's a great question. First of all, many people believe that consciousness is the one thing that has to exist. I mean, this is the sort of Descartes insight. Because I'm having thoughts about whether or not consciousness exists, it
Yeah.
must exist. Um, how far down does it go is a really interesting question. And let me first just bracket the problem by saying, true panpsychism would say that it goes all the way down to include non-biological forms,
Right.
like rocks and molecules, maybe. And I don't think that any useful concept of consciousness includes those things. I just think it loses all of its meanings. And we really do take it to refer to um, some state where it is like something to have an experience. And it just doesn't seem to be able to apply to those really simple circumstances. I think we can start to answer this question if we start to understand the origins of consciousness in life, and we trace back how consciousness came about in evolution. And in this, I am heavily influenced by Antonio Damasio, who's written quite a bit about it recently, and believes that consciousness is born of the processes of life regulation and our monitoring of those, our biological systems trying to keep track of what's happening inside our bodies and building maps, specifically maps of what's happening inside the body. And those maps give rise to these feelings that are basically conscious projections of the internal states of the body, or very first feelings, which are then elaborated in later creatures. So according to that view, if you have some kind of a map of the internal state of your body, you have the potential for consciousness. And if you don't, if you have something really simple like a paramecium, what you're dealing with is not going to be consciousness.
Mhm. Yeah, so I guess you're still left with the question of exactly when do you go from the sort of jump from not conscious to conscious. It seems like you're suggesting it comes at some form of complexity, so it's not like a fundamental property of all life or all matter, as a panpsychist would say.
That's right, but I do think it's not a binary. It's a gradation. I mean, it can exist in very rudimentary proto forms and then become more and more like what we think consciousness is as you get closer and closer to us.
Yeah, I agree with the gradation idea for sure. I've been toying around with the panpsychist idea because it seems to me like you're left with two options. You're either going to say, well, you're either going to be a panpsychist and just say that everything has this whatever fundamental property is related to consciousness, but then it only reaches a certain level of complexity at some point, and we'd only recognize it at some point. But the building blocks are there, so that would be the proto consciousness is fundamental idea. And then there's the other idea, which is this that it emerges at some later point, but that would kind of mean that whatever that point is kind of arbitrarily defined by us to fit a certain definition. So it might not be consciousness in its pure sense if you think about what does it mean to have subjective experience.
I think it's possible for there to be natural phenomenon that arise when certain conditions are met. I think this is one of those cases, and I don't think it's clear what the conditions have to be yet. I think there's a lot of room for argument there. So I outlined a sketch of maybe something to do with functional properties of a system that's monitoring itself. But there are other stabs at this. I mean, there's I'm not a huge fan of the information integration theory of Giulio Tononi, but that's one attempt to define what kind of behaviors a system has to have in order to exhibit consciousness that has to do with, in that view, information integration. So it could be something like that. I mean, any of these things that that emergent phenomena that arise when matter arranges itself into certain patterns of behavior. I think that's conceivable.